Hello, today we're looking at factoring by grouping. Another method for factoring called factor by grouping is where you factor a polynomial that has 4 terms. Factor by grouping only works for 4 terms. To factor by grouping, you're going to group together the first 2 terms of your polynomial and factor out their GCF. Then you're going to group together the second 2 terms of the polynomial, factor out their GCF, and then we're going to see that once we factor both halves of the polynomial, we're going to have the same leftovers, the same parentheses. Since we'll have something with those common parentheses, we can then factor that out and find our final answer. When we factor by grouping, again, it only works for 4 terms. Our final answer is going to be 2 parentheses that look like a FOIL question. Our answers are going to look like a FOIL problem. And to check our answers, we could always FOIL out what we get and make sure that we get back to the original question. So let's look at how this actually works. If you take a look at question number 1, it says factor each polynomial. Notice that here we have our 4 terms. So we're going to start by looking at just the first 2 terms. And we're going to factor out the GCF, the greatest common factor. For the first 2 terms, the greatest common factor, the biggest number that divides into both terms, is 5y. So I'm going to factor out the 5y. Remember, we put that in front of parentheses. And factoring out the GCF is like dividing. So I divide each term by 5y. In the first term, the 5's cancel out. Y squared divided by y is y. Then we have our minus. In the second term, 15 divided by 5 is 3. And the y's cancel each other out. Now I'm going to look at my second set of terms. In the second set of terms, our GCF is 4. That's the biggest number that goes into both items. So again, I'm going to factor out the GCF of the second 2 terms. So they each divide by 4. I'm factoring out a positive 4. You need that plus sign there. And my leftovers are going to go in parentheses. 4y divided by 4 is just y, minus 12 divided by 4 is 3. Okay, now that I take a look at what I have so far, notice that my 2 parentheses in the second step here are exactly the same. I have y minus 3 and another parenthesis with y minus 3. When you factor by grouping, your parentheses always have to be the same. If they're not, you've made a mistake and you should go back and check your work. Typically, if they're not the same, you didn't factor out the greatest common factor, so perhaps look for a bigger number that goes into your terms. But now that we have our 2 parentheses that are the same, we're going to factor those 2 parentheses from each term. So here's one giant term, a plus sign, and another giant term. They each have a y minus 3. So if I factor out that y minus 3 from each term, I can put my leftovers in a second parenthesis. My leftovers are 5y plus 4. This is our final answer. Looks like a FOIL problem, 2 binomials in parentheses. And again, if I want to check my answer, I can always FOIL this out. It would get me back to the original problem. Okay, take a look at question number 2. Again, we have 4 terms, so we have to factor by grouping. I'm going to start with just the first 2 terms. So when I look at the first 2 terms, the greatest common factor here is just an x. Each of the terms have an x that I can divide out. So I'm going to factor out that x by dividing and put my leftovers in parentheses. X squared divided by x is x, plus 5x divided by x is 5. Now when I look at my second set of parentheses, or excuse me, my second set of terms, let's try that again. There we go. In my second set of terms, the greatest common factor is 7. So I'm going to factor out a positive 7. I need that plus sign there. I do that by dividing. 7x divided by 7 is just x, plus 35 divided by 7 is 5. That's a good sign because remember I have to have the exact same parentheses for both of my terms. Now I'm going to factor out that common parenthesis. So if I divide out the x plus 5 from each term, my leftovers go in another set of parentheses, and I'm left with x and this plus 7. This is the final answer. Question number 3, when you take a look at your first two terms, you're going to factor out the GCF. For our first two terms, the biggest number that divides into each is 5, and they each have an a that I can factor out. So I'm going to factor or divide out 5a. So my GCF goes in front of the parentheses. For the first term, 5a divided by 5a is 1. Anything divided by itself is always 1. Then minus, for the second term, 10 divided by 5 is 2. A squared divided by a is a. Now we can take a look at our second set of terms. For the second set, for the numbers, the GCF would be 2. And then each term also has a b that I can factor out. So I'm going to take out a GCF of positive 2b. When I divide the first term by 2b, everything cancels, or 2b divided by 2b is just 1, minus, when I divide the second term by 2b, 4 divided by 2 is 2. The a stays as it is, and the b's cancel out. We have the exact same parentheses for each of our new terms, so that's a good thing. So now we factor out that common parenthesis, 1 minus 2a. And when we factor that from each term, our leftovers go in parentheses. So here we have 5a plus 2b. Okay, let's take a look at one last example. In question number 4, again, we have 4 terms, so we know that we need to do factor by grouping. When we take a look at the first two terms, here the GCF is going to be 3m. So 12m squared divided by 3m is 4m, plus 9m divided by 3m is just 3. When I take a look at my second set of terms, 4m and 3 don't have any common factors bigger than 1. Nothing goes into 4 and 3 other than 1. We have to factor something out when we do factor by grouping. So when this happens, we are going to factor, but we're just factoring out the number 1. Dividing by 1 doesn't change anything. We still have 4m plus 3, but that's good because we have our two parentheses that are the same. We have 4m plus 3 as our leftovers for each term. Just be careful that you do factor out that 1, because once I take out my common parenthesis, 4m plus 3, When I put my leftovers in the second parenthesis, I have 3m, and I need that plus 1 for the last part of the binomial. Remember, these answers have to look like FOIL problems, so every parenthesis has to have two terms. So even if there is no GCF bigger than 1, still take out that 1 because we need it for our final answer. Okay, tonight's homework is down at the bottom of the page here. Please make sure you show all of your work for full credit. This assignment is still due tonight by midnight. You will not have any new work from me tomorrow, so I'll be back on Wednesday. If you have questions, please post them under the comments section of Teams. Have a great day.